In this GlowShift Gauges installation video, we'll show you how to install a GlowShift 7-color series 6-gauge custom dashboard set into an LS-swapped 1973 to 1987 Chevrolet C10. For the purpose of this install, we'll be using a 1977 C10 with a 5.3-liter engine out of a 2000 Silverado to install our gauges. For safety, disconnect the negative battery terminal before starting any work on the vehicle. To install the GlowShift oil pressure sensor, locate a factory oil pressure sensor port and remove the factory sensor or oil line. Be sure to have a drain pan ready to catch any oil that may drain from the plug. Install the LS oil pressure sensor thread adapter into the oil galley and tighten with a 3/4 inch wrench or socket. Insert the GlowShift pressure sensor into the port and tighten using a 22mm wrench or socket. Connect the pressure sensor wiring harness to the sensor. Be sure to keep it clear of any moving parts or direct heat sources. To install the water temperature sensor, locate a temperature sensor port on the passenger side of the engine. Remove the sensor or plug from the port. Be sure to have a drain pan ready to catch any remaining coolant that may drain from the head. Install the LS water temperature sensor thread adapter into the head and tighten with a 16mm wrench or socket. Wrap the threads of the GlowShift temperature sensor with Teflon tape and insert the sensor into the adapter. Tighten the sensor using a 14mm wrench. In order to install your new GlowShift dash cluster, the factory cluster needs to be removed. Under the dash, press the headlamp switch release button and remove the headlamp switch knob. Start by removing the screws securing the factory cluster with a Phillips head screwdriver and remove the knobs from the radio. Once the screws have been removed, remove the factory cluster. Remove the factory gauge cover and gauges from the dash using a 1/4 inch wrench or nut driver. You will need to release the clip and remove the speedometer cable from the back of the factory speedometer, along with the factory oil pressure line. Install a grommet or a plug in the firewall to protect the new harness and/or block the opening. Route the oil pressure sensor harness through the firewall and into the cabin. Remove the factory gauge cluster mounting panel to gain access to the dash harness. Remove the factory speedometer cable from the firewall. You will need to cut a hole in the new cluster for the 1973 to 1980 headlight and wiper switches or the 1981 to 1987 headlight switch. Please select the correct template included with the instructions for your year range and use it as a guide to cut the openings. If your truck comes with AC vents, remove the AC duct from the factory cluster and install it into the new cluster using the included screws. If your particular truck does not come with AC vents, install the included AC vent block-off plates and secure them using the included screws. Install each gauge into the pod using the mounting brackets, washers, and nuts. Be sure not to over-tighten the nuts as it will damage the gauges. Once all of the gauges have been installed, insert the wiring harness into each designated gauge. Secure all loose harnesses with zip ties. Locate the fuel level signal wire in the dash harness and splice the fuel level signal wire from the gauge using a splice connector. In our case, the factory wire is a brown wire. In order for the fuel gauge to display the proper fuel level, you will need to adjust the dial on the back of the gauge to match the proper ohm rating for your specific vehicle's fuel level sensor. You can test the rating on the sender with a multimeter or look up the specific range in the vehicle repair manual. Once the wire is connected, plug the dash harness back into the factory gauge cluster mount. Pull the oil pressure sensor harness up from the firewall and through the factory gauge cluster mount. Pass the gauge power and sensor wires through the factory gauge cluster mount. Reinstall the factory gauge cluster mount into the dash. It may be necessary to trim parts of the cluster mount. Depending on your factory gauge options, you have to make sure there is enough room for the new gauges to fit when installed. Secure all loose harnesses and wires behind the new gauge cluster and secure the cluster to the dash using the factory screws. Reinstall the headlight switch knob and radio knobs. Run the water temp signal wires through the firewall and to the temperature sensor location. Attach the female silver connector and the longer rubber cover to one end of the green wire from the gauge wiring harness and connect it to the white wire from the sensor. Then attach the male silver connector and the short rubber cover to the end of the black wire from the gauge wiring harness and connect it to the black wire from the sensor. Be sure to secure any loose wires away from any direct heat sources using zip ties. Route the speedometer and tachometer signal wires from the gauges to the vehicle's ECU and splice them into the appropriate wires on the harness. Depending on your vehicle's available sensors, different adapters may be needed to get a good signal. In order to test for power, reconnect the negative battery terminal. Using a test light, locate a fuse that receives 12-volt constant power. Then locate a fuse that receives 12-volt power when the ignition is turned on. Next, locate a fuse that receives 12-volt power when the headlights are turned on. Attach wire connectors or expandable circuits to the yellow, red, and orange wires from the gauges. Then connect the yellow wire to the constant 12-volt fuse. Connect the red wire to the ignition-only 12-volt fuse. And connect the orange wire to the headlight 12-volt fuse. Attach a ring terminal connector to the black wire from the gauges and connect it to a clean, reliable grounding source under the dash. Prior to starting the vehicle, be sure to refill the radiator with fresh coolant and top off the oil. Power your gauges to ensure that everything is working properly by starting the vehicle. You've now successfully installed your GlowShift 7 Color Series 6-gauge custom dashboard set to an LS-swapped 1973 to 1987 Chevrolet C10. If you have any questions, concerns, or comments, please contact us at 1-888-GS-GAUGE, and we'll see you on the road.